And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So thank y'all for joining. What I'm hoping to cover today is just an overview and an introduction to our Wake County Food Security Plan update, and how we develop the goals and the visions, the strategies that are involved, and then in terms of how the community, you all, can be involved in the action and engagement within this plan. And I have a timeline for the funding and how that will be released, and other areas that you might like to plug in to the project. And then again, if we have time, I wanted to dig in to some of the lessons learned, some of the tools we used in the process that could be helpful for those wanting to do a community engaged process in your work. So the ultimate goal and vision of this food security plan update was to transition our current model of food charity more to food resilience. So we wanted to focus within the plan on strategies around building economic opportunity and community resilience, while also improving food access and the health outcomes for our food insecure populations. So it's kind of a combination of both immediate strategies and then some longer term capacity building work in the community, all with the desire from our steering committee and our partners to really bring community with us as we do this work and make sure that we have really equitable and focused models that meet the needs of the community. So from our steering committee, and I'll dive into a little bit more about what made that steering committee. The big idea was we wanted to increase access to food. We wanted to build sustainability and economic benefits. And then we also wanted to overall increase the understanding and the commitment of those making decisions about our food system to be more aware of a resilient model of food systems and to incorporate that into the policies and decisions that are made. As we dove deeper into the plan, we kind of broke that down into 4 big goals that we wanted to move forward. One was an understanding that during COVID, there was a big break in our distribution systems, and we needed to address supply chain network issues so that in the future, should an emergency occur, we're more resilient, we're better able to respond quickly, and we have the ability to quickly source product from our local farmers and vendors in the counties that we work. We also wanted within that to be sure that our pantry partners and our emergency food partners understood where to access food, could access really good quality food, and we could infuse more money into our local farms and try to keep that money more within our county and our region circulating versus going to a food aggregator in Florida, for instance. We also got a lot of feedback about the need to build our partners' capacity to serve communities that are experiencing specific health or accessibility challenges. So that could be cultural issues, language barriers, but also a lot of pantries are serving clients who have chronic diet-related illnesses, and they need access to foods that promote better health, and they just didn't feel that that was available. We also hope that this plan will strengthen outreach so that we have more folks that are eligible for services enrolling in those services, and also that the community in our county is aware that food access is an issue, because I think there is a misunderstanding often that because Wake County is so affluent, hunger isn't an issue, but we have almost 10% of our population, over 100,000 people battling food insecurity every day. So it is clearly an issue. We're a highly populous county. We have pockets of need in every area of the county, and we want to make sure people are aware of that. We've already taken a step to move this forward. A lot of those strategies with outreach and awareness didn't involve a ton of funding needs. And so we're doing a hunger awareness month all this month with events like this for people to be able to better understand the problems and some of the solutions or ways they can engage in addressing the issues of food insecurity. The last kind of goal of the food plan was one that we felt fell out of our scope as the cooperative extension. And we know it's being addressed in a lot of areas of the county already. And so we want food security to be at the table, but we know that we couldn't do this work justice. And that was investing in service integration efforts, looking at root cause issues of hunger, barriers to upward mobility. So that includes like housing support, a living wage, more equitable access to particular services. And we felt that a lot of that just fell beyond what we could do in this 3-year time frame with the funding and the capacity that we had to do. So these are the 8 strategies that we put before the county. I'll dive into them a little bit more, but they kind of bridge out as we're working towards more resilience, from really broad, more capacity building work to the really in-depth targeted strategies like produce prescription programs. We were awarded $7.2 million in American Rescue Plan funds from Wake County to do this work. All of the investments were estimated by talking through partners doing the work, getting an idea of what the costs might be for these projects. And so they all kind of have an allocated bucket within them. And then surrounding the entire plan was the desire to make sure we kept our equity focused model of community engagement and decision-making moving forward as we address the plan. So we have funding for a food justice cohort that will be helping us design our RFPs, request for proposals, and release that funding and review the proposals that we receive. We also will have 2 interns that are going to help us in the work half-time. And we'll host a series of food justice trainings. This is a series of 4 trainings this late summer, early fall, and that'll help the community have a shared language around food justice work. So in terms of some strategies that we put forth that are more immediate in their ability to address need, one are some funds for the 2 food banks in the area to purchase more local produce and meats, eggs, dairy. The goal here is to keep this federal American Rescue Plan money in the region. So it may not be all Wake County farmers. We don't have enough farmers to source that. It'd be the region. Within this funding, we're really prioritizing BIPOC farms, women-owned farms, but there's quite a large agricultural community to source from. Both of our food banks are already doing this. This is funds to just expand that work a little bit further, and then that'll funnel down into our food pantries. We also have requested funds for community health workers to go out and help food insecure clients know what other resources are available to them. How can they expand their household budget? What kind of housing support is out there? What sort of nutrition programs might be available? Or there's just so many resources that a lot of folks aren't aware of. And so these community health workers are really great advocates for communities, especially communities that are fearful of receiving services if they have citizenship barriers or things like that. Our community health workers are really helpful. There are funds to increase mobile markets to areas of the county that do have gaps in access. There is also funds for produce prescription, for a produce prescription program to serve up to 1,000 clients. We're going to be hosting some more meetings around that. That's another place for engagement I'll talk about. But this is really looking at addressing the needs of food insecure clients who have chronic diet-related illness, helping them get more fresh produce. The goal is to source that produce from local farms. And we have a really great mobile phone app that people can use to order the produce. We're hoping to launch that with some community-based health centers like Alliance Medical Ministries, Advance, and possibly a few of the hospitals. But we haven't started those conversations yet. So that was the goal from the steering committee as we developed that. We also have funding to do some Smart Start programs where we'll infuse local produce into early child care centers with the hope that long-term there might be a sliding scale produce box program available at child care centers where a parent might be able to get a free produce box and another parent could purchase a produce box. So it's kind of subsidizing the different income levels of the parents attending those centers. Longer term capacity work to support all this. So right now we have a fairly okay sourcing of local produce, but it wasn't to the degree that we needed to really support all the programs we would like it to. So we did a food hub feasibility study in 2021, and we looked at how do we create a more equitable and resilient food aggregation system from our local farmers. And that resulted in a list of strategies that we could use to help those who are supporting our local farmers and aggregating that product with better storage and better distribution capacity. We hope to build up these partners so that after the 3 years, they have a really economically solid model and they can continue to partner with food pantries, childcare centers, all of those groups, and source local fresh produce at an affordable rate. We have funds for food pantries that would like to innovate. So that could be if they want to find a way to source more fresh produce, if they want to meet needs of their clients beyond just food access, if they want to partner with a group of pantries in the area for a communal storage facility so that they can buy more produce or food at a cheaper rate because they can buy more at a time. There's funds for communal gardens. So these are gardens that are growing a large portion of food communally to source to either a food pantry or a neighborhood distribution that's affordable or free, not necessarily individual growing plots. This is more a collective big garden growing. And those funds could be anything to support season extension, irrigation, building these gardens, and there will be a range of funding available. We've actually changed the name of this cohort. It's actually a food justice cohort now. But that is a group of about 5 to 6 individuals from the community. We're hoping to have representation from largely our BIPOC community, our Latinx and Hispanic clients, immigrant communities, so that they can look through the funding that we have, help us design requests for proposals, and then review those proposals to determine how funding is allocated. This was a big point of desire from our steering committee, was to make sure that our smaller community-led organizations get the same access to funds as some of these bigger ones that have more capacity to apply for these big grants. And then we're also going to be doing a collective data portal. And this will be a way for partners to input data, and we can track how we're doing across a variety of partners, gardens, pantries, food banks. We have some data like that, but nothing that's local. The hope is that partners can then generate reports to apply for funding and things like that. So really hoping to support some smaller groups to be able to display the great work that they're doing. So I mentioned the food justice cohort. This is the wrong slide information underneath it. We are going to start recruiting for that group this summer, and I can share more. I think my slides got jumbled. That food justice cohort, we're going to start recruiting for this month and next month. We're designing them with the Wake County DEI office and community food strategies. Lashana Austria is supporting that work. So right now we're kind of building the framework, getting feedback from partners, and we'll recruit those members this month. They will be paid for their time as community experts, and we have funds to pay them through the funding through 2026. We have released the Food Hub aggregation pilot or RFP. We released that this month. Those are for partners that are wanting to aggregate local food from farmers. So that is released, and I have a link in this presentation that we'll send out to everyone afterwards to where you can find those requests for proposals. All the funding for this project will have to be released through formal RFPs because it is federal dollars. We are also getting prepared to release our local food sourcing RFP for our food banks. Next month, we hope to award both of those funding streams, and we're going to be hosting some community meetings around data. So what do you collect now? What would you like to know more about your community as it relates to food security? And what's a more equitable way or a better picture than just a pounds of food count for food served? Because we know that that is not always the best measure, because a bunch of sweet potatoes are a lot heavier than lettuce, but we know they're both really nutritionally valuable. And so it's oftentimes not a whole picture of access if you're comparing pounds of food and equating it to meals. And we can send information on those meetings as we get them scheduled out to this group as well. In August, we'll be onboarding some interns, and we'll be hosting community meetings to give feedback on the produce prescription program. This is another opportunity for partners to engage in the process, to tell us, what do you think would be the most valuable partners to work with for a produce prescription program? What would that program look like in terms of the types of foods? Do we want prepared meals? Do we just want produce? So that will happen in August and September. In September, we'll do our community food justice trainings and also onboard and orient our food justice cohort so that in the following months, they can start to develop the RFPs and start launching them. October is when our community garden funding opportunity will be released. November, we hope to have those awarded so that gardens can plan for the spring season. And in November, we'll also release the pantry funding opportunity and our community health worker funding. December, I think also in November, we're hoping to do our mobile market funding release. And then in December, we'll award the mobile markets. And January, we will award the funds for pantries, community health workers, and the produce prescription pilot funding will be released then. After January, we're really hoping the produce prescription program could get started by late spring, early summer. That one is a little more complex, but that's the goal. And that can serve 1,000 clients. And I think it has some really promising long-term support that we could get from other funders to keep that work going. So here is the link to where all our opportunities will be posted. That's definitely a way for partners to engage, is to apply for these funds, share the funding opportunities with partners that may not typically be on certain listservs or get the information. Anyone that's funded has to be in our vendor portal. That can take a while. So if you really anticipate applying, you might just go ahead and register within that vendor portal. We are also going to be actively recruiting for our food justice cohort. If that is of interest to you, it's going to be about 15 hours a month at $50 an hour for people to give us input into the plan. So we're going to be sending out recruitment materials and interviewing for that cohort in the next couple of months. If you really want to get ongoingly ongoing. If you want to get active long-term in this work, we have a food policy council that you can join. We also have some regional food security groups in the north. We have the Northern Food Security Team, that's Wake Forest, Rollsville. The east, we have the Eastern Wake Food Family, that's Zebulon, Nightdale, Wendell, Fuquay, Varina, Holly Springs, Summit Garner, Willow Springs. We have the Southern Food Security Group. And then there is also in the west, I'm going to say it wrong. It's I know Jocelyn's on here, the Western Wake Food Action Committee. That's wrong.
Western, it's the Western Regional Food Security Action Group.
There we go. I knew I got like a few of the keywords there. Thank you, Jocelyn.
Yeah, no problem.
So those are ways that you can do some local participation. And what we're really hoping is that within these regions, folks will come together and submit proposals as a joint kind of collective. I think that is where we'll see the greatest capacity over time. There's a link to the Capital Area Food Network website here. The Food Access Circle is one that is going to be tracking the food plan. We hope to host quarterly community information sessions to give updates on the food plan, hear from our food security partners about what they're doing. That's what we did with the last food plan. And we took a lot of that information and input and brought it into this iteration of the plan. I think I've already talked about the shared data portal. Anyone that's funded through the project, their data is going to get input there, but we also have a small amount of funds to support partners to provide data that aren't funded through the county, but want to submit community garden data in terms of produce that they're growing or other things like that. We want to have a better understanding of gaps. Where is the need in the county? Where is it being addressed now? And we want our partners to know that too, so that they can see across the whole county, across all the partners engaged in this work, where are the gaps so that we can all make more informed decisions and not duplicate work that's already going on. And we hope too, it'll help partners be more aware of their neighbors and who else is doing this work in the community. So I already know we're probably not going to have time for the second half of this. I want to make sure I give time for questions. It's dense material. I've tried a million different ways to present it. But I would love to take some questions that folks have, or comments that are popping up.
Hello, I'm Deidre McCullers. I'm a social justice advocate, and I have a series of questions.
Okay.
How did this group come together? The group of y'all partners and stuff. How did y'all come together? And who's a part of this team? Also, do y'all feel that slavery plays a part in this so-called food insecurity? And if so, do you or your partners advocate for reparations for the descendants of slaves?
Yeah, and I realized my slide on how we formed this group is in the second half of this presentation. We utilized a snowball method. So we asked partners to nominate members of the community that they thought would be interested in participating in the food plan update. And we paid those members for their time. And then we also pulled together partners that are active in our regional food security networks and our food policy council, so that we could get a bigger picture from both community and partners doing the work. That definitely had a learning curve. And I would do more upfront training with everyone so that we could have a shared understanding. And then we also did some focus groups in the community where we paid for their time. Those were done at food pantries with community members that were food insecure to get their feedback on the issues and the barriers they were facing, some of the things that they would really like to see more of. And then after we went through the steering committee and those focus groups, we had a series of work groups that were open to anyone who wanted to join. a lot of our steering committee members carried over and participated in that work, and they helped us build out the specific strategies from there. The team, I mean, right now, it's myself and Trevor Hyde is our local food agent. We're kind of trying to help develop the timeline and get this work going, but it is very much, we want it to be community owned. Primarily, we want it to be implemented through the Food Policy Council, which is open to anyone to join. We're hoping that the plan can help us build our Food Policy Council so that there's more people there and active in the work so that we have a more holistic picture. We did talk about systemic racism and its impacts on long-term health and issues within communities of color. We did not talk about reparations. That didn't come up from our steering committee. A living wage did, and there's some work going on underway with the county for that. Our hope is through funding a lot of BIPOC-led organizations that we can infuse those communities with more funds. So some of the partners that were active in our food hub feasibility study was the Black Farmers Hub, which is Demetrius Hunter. He also runs Grocers on Wheels, if you're familiar with that. The Black Farmers Market, Fertile Ground Food Co-op. So they gave us a lot of really great feedback on how can we build the economic resilience in their communities and have them involved in the decision-making processes. So we tried to do that in the plan, but no, we didn't talk about reparations. That was a really long response, Deidre.
And it was a great one as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions?
Hi, Sydney, this is Wanda Hunter.
Hey, Wanda.
So I'm hearing a lot of information here, and I participated in the first part of the food steering committee, and a lot of this information is sounding different from what I had heard before. And so I'm concerned because I don't think we were given the opportunity to connect over to the second part of the steering committee, but that's beyond us now, and that's neither here nor there. My question to you is about the community health workers. You talked about community health workers, and the state actually has a curriculum. Does that include the training for the community health workers, which is a 6 months training, and the state certification? Also, I just heard you say, talking about the Fertile Ground Co-op, but I didn't hear anything about them within the plan. I heard about resourcing fresh produce and things of that nature, and working with certain pantries about shelf life and things of that nature, but I didn't hear it now that the Fertile Ground Food Co-op is landed upon a location for their grocery store. I did not hear anything in reference to any of the funding being utilized in that specific manner. The other thing that I would definitely say is a huge blind spot when we're talking about food security, and that is recognizing that we have a homeless problem. We have a housing crisis right now. So I don't care how much produce that you give to somebody who is homeless, if they have no place to go prepare their food, then what do they do? And so that has been overlooked in several different manners. And I can say that for the last few years, because I myself have went out on holidays such as Thanksgiving and Christmas and delivered prepared meals to individuals who are living in hotels or homeless or things of that nature. And so I don't know what type of revamping that we can do, but I think that is something that we need to look into if we have this much money available, because those are some of the people with the critical instances of having food insecurity. And I know in other parts of the nation, for instance, in California, they have a restaurant meals program so that those individuals can actually use their EBT benefits and go to certain restaurants that will accept and allow them to have hot meals.
Yeah.
Those are some of the things that I noticed, and just a couple of the questions that I had.
Yeah. So the community health workers was written, it doesn't include training, but I think that one's going to go through our food justice cohort to talk through. And I think there's still some flexibility there, because that has come up a couple times. Does it include training? Because that is a resource that is not available. So I think that one is, not set to be that way, but saying that, I think our food justice cohort might talk through, we're going to talk through that with them. Fertile Ground Food Co-op is kind of a mistiming or a bad alignment of timing with the food plan development, but I have been talking with some other groups about other options to fund that capital project, but we did not allocate funds in there for them. Primarily, we are hoping that some of the other entities that aggregate product will be able to use that funding and sell to them, but that is not included. And then, yeah, I agree, housing is a big issue. That's beyond the scope of us, but I know Wake County in general is trying to have more collaborative processes to discuss these issues. And so I'm hopeful that we're starting to move towards that more, but I do think some of the pantry innovation grants could be a really good opportunity for a pantry to apply if they want to specifically support a homeless population with, frozen prepared meals or pop-top cans, things that are easily prepared either over like a small cook stove or in a microwave, those types of things. I think a pantry could apply for, not to the scale that we need. And then there's also, I know in Raleigh, there is a place at the table, which serves homeless populations. They can go in and it's pay what you can. And the town of Wake Forest, not the town, but a partner in Wake Forest is also trying to do a pay what they can restaurant up there. I know that's under, it's in like planning interest phases. But thank you, that was great feedback. I see Betsy question about community kitchen access for food preparation. That came up in the last food plan. It didn't come up in this food plan process as far as I remember. I think there's honestly a really great opportunity for the food access circle to talk with churches that have those big commercial kitchens about developing a program like that. I think we have a lot of those resources. It's just a matter of getting the right people at the table to talk about what that would look like. And yes, I'll share the PowerPoint. Other questions?
I have a question, Sydney. Are the intern positions limited to what are the parameters for the intern positions?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of parameters yet. We're working on the work plans now. They'll be 20 hours a week, paying at the county living wage rate, which was $18.23 an hour when we developed the plan. And other than that, we're really looking for folks that have some experience in food system or food security work, that might have nonprofit experience, but really we're looking for individuals that can hit the ground running. But I do think some food security knowledge would be helpful. But other than that, there's not a lot of limitations. Other questions?
Sydney, as this is one of the first meetings, are you open to those who are online now and or additional partners to join? Or is this where you want to keep it, maximum?
No, absolutely. We're going to plan, there's going to be a Capital Area Food Network orientation and kind of information session in August. We'll have some food. We'll talk about some projects. What I would really like is for us to get back to, we used to hold these community meetings. Anybody could come and we'd have, upward of 75 people in the room talking about the work that they were doing and networking with each other. I want this plan to be a catalyst for that to occur again. So there's absolutely still room to join in and participate in this process as we move forward.
Have we looked at youth engagement?
So we have the Youth Food Security Summit on June 23rd. We didn't really incorporate the food plan into that. but I think that's something that CAP and Food Access has talked about a little bit. We've tried to have a youth food security circle. It's hard to get youth engaged. So, I mean, I think that's something that could happen, but we haven't done a lot of planning beyond trying to just get the youth engaged in general.
Sydney, I have another question. This is Wanda. So the Wake County Health and Human Services Board has 5 priorities for the next 3 years, and one of those happens to be food insecurity. How do you plan on working together with what the Wake County Health and Human Services Board has and with the county commissioners' goals and visions for the county as food security?
Yeah, so right now, I report for the Community Health and Vitality 4.1 and 2, which is the equitable access to food in the county. And the other one is local food sourcing. I know when I presented to the Health and Human Services, we talked about me potentially sitting in on those meetings and being a part of that subcommittee, but I haven't gotten anything else. I think that would be a great opportunity. I would also really love for more. We used to have a lot of Health and Human Services staff that would come to CAFN, which is our Food Policy Council, would come to those circles. And I would really like if we could revamp that. COVID kind of killed a lot of we had a lot of staff turnover, but that's what I'm hoping for. The other thing I've talked about too, and we haven't formed it, is kind of an internal county departments could engage in like a food security team, but that hasn't gotten very far just because of a matter of time. Other questions? Horace, I see you went off mute. Did you have a question?
Well, I'm new to what your endeavor is here, although I've been involved in trying to make progress with food security across Africa and Southeast Asia for some time. And a lot of the things that I've learned after 7 years of working on this is that, we have to rethink how we build systems, but we have to rethink them from the person that has the problem. So how do we, and so that's where a lot of my time has been spent, that says, look, we're getting to the place in the world where nobody can afford to buy something made by somebody else. And people at the bottom of the economy have never been able to afford to buy anything new made by somebody. So a lot of what I've done is said, okay, why don't we try to find a way to use technology to allow more to be produced in the local community. Now, and most of that effort's been in Africa, and I've made some fairly good progress. And but I've sent you notes that I'd like to come in and sit down and explain to you what I have done, so that we can determine if the efforts that I've been working on for years in Africa really apply. And I'm confident a lot of what I've learned in Africa applies to the things that we're trying to do. And some of the things I say is, look, with technology, if we could just find a way to, even some of the homeless people carry cell phones. And so if we could just find a way to say, your cell phone is going to show you where everything is and we'll deliver it to you in your tent. And so those are the efforts that I'm doing. I've said, look, technology today provides us the systems that we could provide visibility to anybody that has a cell phone to every location for food within 50 miles of them. And we can create supply chain systems that would then deliver it to them the same day, just like Amazon does. So those are the things that I've been working on primarily in Africa.
Yeah, we've been doing a project with the company Tangelo, and that's a mobile food delivery app that is free, and we've recruited clients through that. But I do think we need, that came out with the outreach to the need to have better sharing of the resources. We have a lot of online resources, but it's just hard to access and know what's there.
That's the piece that I've learned. And I keep telling everybody, we all tend to do things vertically and we'll never solve the problem working vertically. So we can't look at food. We have to look at the needs of the poor and say, okay, how do I give them access to everything they need? And how do I show them what's available? So we have to, and those are the pieces that I'm finally beginning to get some acceptance on in Africa that says, look, everything needs to be designed from the aspect of the homeless person. It can't be designed with the goal. If you look at how almost everybody designs everything, they say, okay, how can I make money off of this? And that's their design. The whole process. That's what everybody's taught in college, do these things so you find a way to make money. And so over the last few years, I've tried to convince people, and we're having some success. Reverse it. This is okay. Define the problem and develop a solution for the problem. Don't make making money one of the criteria for what you build. If you add value, you'll find a way to at least cover your expense. And that's the other thing I say, if we're going to architect systems for the bottom, we can't make them profit centers. We have to make them cost centers. And that's not in the standard design process or philosophy, the way most things are done. So,
yeah, a lot of the funding that we're in the Food Hub aggregation RFP that we released, we are asking those partners to share how do they support their community beyond their business model. So are they giving back? How are they giving back?
Look at your calendar, and I'm here in Raleigh.
Okay, sounds good.
Give me some time, and I'd really like to come and sit with you for a while.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I have. I appreciate what you do.
Thanks for coming. And we probably have time for one more question.
When will the, this is Deidre McCullers again, when will the PowerPoint be emailed?
I can, I need to get the list from whoever has access to my sign up sheet. I think it's Riley. Once I get that list, I'll send it out after. I'm hoping to get it out. I have a meeting in Raleigh from 1 to 3, but I should be able to get it out by the end of today.
Oh, I didn't register, but I did put my email in the chat.
Okay. Yep. I'll add you on there. I'll probably actually just capture the emails. I'll find you. I think I have your email, Deidre, somewhere. So yeah, if you didn't register and you want me to send you the presentation, just put your email in the chat. And yeah, Elizabeth Eichen is saying it'll also be posted on the wake.gov/hunger awareness website. So you can also go there. All right. Well, with that, I'm happy to stay on for another couple of minutes if you have questions and you would like to ask them, but otherwise I really appreciate y'all coming. I will be sending out more information on community meetings around the food plan as we get a little more planned. To be honest, we are like going 100 miles per hour, but I appreciate y'all coming. Absolutely email me if questions come up afterwards. And I hope y'all have a great rest of your week.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Sadie, this is Rich Voynich. Got a question.
Yeah.
I threw it in the chat, but I'm sorry, I'm multitasking. Maybe I missed it. Do we have any mechanism for trying to teach people how to grow their own food?
Yeah, that came up a little bit in the food plan, but it didn't get voted to the top as people went through because they felt, particularly our communities that had lived experience, they just didn't feel that there's a lot of time that they have to invest in gardening. But I think the funding,
people have time to go and pick up food, but you can't. I guess I have a problem when we're just giving food to people, and I understand the reasons why.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of opportunity for people to grow their own food easily.
Yeah.
And to help one to avoid decrease their carbon footprint by picking vegetables in your own garden, but also to teach people how, and then to teach children how, so that the next generation goes. I'm just saying, I think that's that's a major deficiency. If this is what our food plan is, if it's only about giving food to people, okay, then fine. But if we're really trying to solve the problem, I mean, 100 years ago, people grew their own food in their own gardens, even if it was a small garden or in container gardens or in their backyard. I guess I don't understand why that isn't a bad model that we should be looking at going forward too.
Yeah, well, we
If I
also
may-
acknowledge like Interfaith Food Shuttle has a really, they're trying to expand
Yes,
Gardens for Everyone program.
sure. And Master
Sydney,
Gardeners have the same thing too, right? We have Ready Garden Grow programs with the libraries. We have lots
Yeah.
of mechanisms to do it. But again, I think I would love to see that as part of the plan that says food security starts with you, right? Starts with people's
Rich.
ability to be able to grow their own food.
Rich, Sydney, can I add something to this conversation?
Absolutely.
Because I think that some of these populations and these communities that we're referring to, when you say that they don't have the time, they really don't have the time. When we're talking about people who are working 2 and 3 jobs, their children are bused hours away from them to go to school. And then they're wanting to be, the school system wants them to be active in their children's lives. They're working 2 and 3 jobs. What other time do they have to
Yeah,
tend to
so
a garden?
Wanda, I will argue that, yes, if you have a 2-acre garden, sure, it takes time. If you have a potted plant in a pot and a tomato outside of on your deck, on your porch, I can't buy that that's going to take a lot of time.
Right, but is that going to
It-
feed my family? When we're talking about food insecurity, we're talking
But
about,
yeah,
I
I
don't
understand
have
it's
enough
not going to
food
feed your
for a
family,
meal.
but neither is a box of food that you get every week going to feed your whole family for the entire week.
It
So
may not feed them
it's
for the
all
week,
part
but
of
it'll
it.
make a meal.
But so will tomatoes